episode of Smart Health, we welcome Parul Singh. Parul is a partner at Initialized Capital, a seed-stage VC firm with $3.2 billion assets under management and a portfolio including Coinbase, Flexport, Instacart, and Rippling. Parul invests in health tech as well as data and analytics startups at Initialized. Previously, she was an investor at Founder Collective, and she spent a decade as an engineer and product manager at the New York Times and Fast Company. She was also the founder of an edtech analytics company. In this episode, we get a glimpse into the hottest trends in health tech, how investment decisions are made, where Parul sees white space in the industry, and some of her personal wellness strategies to stay on top of her work and wellness as a busy professional. Hi, Parul. Welcome to the podcast. We're so excited to have you here.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm super excited to be here as well.
We'd love to hear a little bit more about your story. How did you get involved in venture capital and investing in health tech specifically?
I got involved in venture capital a little bit by accident. I was actually really set on being a startup founder, and I was immersed in the Boston startup scene. And I helped a friend of mine get a job at a local Boston startup. And after I did that, he introduced me to a local VC firm that had actually made a job offer to him. And they asked me to work with them part-time, helping them due diligence on startups, using my background as a product manager and a former engineer. I then left and went and had my own founding journey. And after shutting down my own edtech startup, that firm recruited me back to work full time. I guess I had had a really great experience working there, and I had impressed them enough to have them make that ask. And I spent 4 years there before joining my current fund, Initialized, as a partner 2 years ago. So that's my story.
So you went from edtech as a founder to now you're investing across a lot of different areas, but health tech specifically. How did you get involved on the health tech side?
So I started working in my family's medical practice when I was 11 or 12 years old. And a lot of the work that I did helped me understand companies that I have since become involved in as an investor. So for example, I was typing notes on patient visits into the EHR, which later helped me find and get excited about a company called HealthNote, which does that. I was helping my mom, who's pretty non-technical, rebill co-payments, which got me excited about a company where our fund is an investor in, that's called Apero Health. And they had a diagnostic lab inside of their office and some extra space that they had. And that gets me excited about a company that I'm in now called Simple Health Kit. So those are just a few of the examples. I helped my fund invest in 6 really amazing healthcare founders, as well as 3 now unicorn anti-portfolio companies that we missed. And I just love how this category is very impactful and very complicated. And I wanted to spend more time there when I joined Initialized.
What are some of the biggest problems you're seeing in healthcare right now that some of these founders are solving?
That's a great question. One of the things that I think is huge right now is the care provider shortage. We've all seen in the past 5 years, essentially a massive attack on the healthcare system. And post-COVID, I think that provider burnout is really exacerbated. And with what were already going to be provider shortages. So in California right now, where I live, it takes 6 months to see a primary care provider, and 40% of people don't have one. And it's equally bad, if not worse, in other subspecialties. So I think it's a huge problem because shortages take time. There's no quick and easy fix to this. There's not, you can't replace physicians. You can't fill spots left by people who are retiring very easily. And luckily, I do think that tech can address some of those gaps and kind of help scale care. Another really big problem that I'm obsessed with is making sense of the tidal wave of data that has become available in healthcare. So we have more sources of data than we've ever had before. I'm a huge data geek, which is probably why I get drawn into this so much. But we've got the whole genome, we've got all these new diagnostics, we've got personal wearables, but neither patients or providers or even therapeutics or folks who are developing new treatments, they don't have all the tools or infrastructure that they need to be able to process all of that data that's coming in. So as an example, one of the companies that I'm invested in, Bristle, has an oral microbiome diagnostic that's new. And never before has there been a test which you could take which would actually predict whether your likelihood of getting a cavity before you get one. But their, biggest thing that they're trying to figure out is how to get dentists to use this and incorporate it into their daily practices, which they're just not used to doing. So where we're going is really, really exciting, but right now there are a lot of gaps in the infrastructure that we need to get there. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities.
In terms of how you think about bridging that gap between where we are and what that future looks like, what are some of the tools, technologies, trends that you envision seeing to help solve that problem and bridge that gap?
In some cases, it's data infrastructure. So I just invested in a company, we haven't announced it yet, so I can't say what it is, but that's essentially building a snowflake for biotech, where I would say that the infrastructure is a little bit even further behind than it is in the rest of healthcare. But with all the volume of data that I was just talking about that you have, there are really just not the same tools they have a different set of constraints. Sometimes they're pulling data from diagnostic devices, or they're analyzing different data formats that are not standard in the rest of business, or they also have to have a layer that helps deal with PII. So there's really the need for a different set of infrastructure there. So I've definitely been excited about that space and the opportunities there.
It sounds like a lot of this has the ability to really rapidly transform what healthcare looks like over the next 5-10 years. I know we were talking about before this podcast how D2C and some of these consumer health advancements have done that job over the past 10 years. Do you see the technology, this infrastructure play as being that next thing that moves the needle? Or what else do you think will kind of help the system change so rapidly the way that the D2C and consumer health movement has?
Healthcare does not move quickly, right? We know that. And
sometimes is an understatement.
I know, yeah. So the other part of that, besides the tools and the infrastructure, is workflows and training, and there's a lot of human change that has to happen. However, what we do see is that sometimes new providers will leapfrog the existing technology and sort of bring the rest of the system along. And I see that happening. We have a couple of companies that are doing unique diagnostics that we see adoption for. The other thing is that something I've learned over my investing career is that sometimes when you have something like increased data or better tools, and it has to fit into a complicated stack like healthcare, right? Like there's so many parts to it. There's so many moving pieces when you're getting care that when you have a new tool that is just replacing one tiny little brick in that structure, sometimes it's more successful when they rebuild the whole structure as a whole. So sometimes a new provider that's based on using all your wearable data, for example, and everything, the tech, the clinicians, everything is sort of has that built in. That may sometimes be faster, or we may see changes faster there. And sometimes I think the rest of the system may lag, although I'm optimistic it will get there, because these are, I can't think of many areas besides healthcare where the people who work in it are so motivated to kind of do good and, provide better care. So I think we'll get there eventually, but in different ways.
And how do you think AI will play a role in all of this? Obviously, massive new technology, newer to some, older to others, but it's a shift kind of how we approach building as innovators and as investors for yourself. So how do you think AI changes where we are or invents something new in terms of the healthcare system?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think definitely something that a lot of healthcare investors are thinking about right now. We have invested in 5 companies that are using AI over time. And to be honest, only one of them was this year. Most of them are 3 or 4 or 5 years old already. So I feel like we've gotten a really great seat to be able to see what's happening and some of these trends as they've developed. And to be honest, before they became the trend that they are now. And I see one big area where we've invested in has been improving and augmenting clinical decision making, so decision support. I was talking about the large volume of data that is available, and it's a lot for humans to kind of process that. So one of the companies that we've invested in called Radial Analytics, they're providing clinical decision support. So they would analyze a patient's record and tests and provide a risk score. So when patients are getting discharged from the hospital, how likely is this patient to be readmitted? How far have they progressed? So that the nurse can make a decision about where they should go. There's a big impact in workflows. So healthcare workflows are notoriously complicated and difficult, and sometimes clinicians or office staff are logging into 5 different systems to do things, or don't even get me started on healthcare billing. We have a company called Athelis, which is doing multiple things to kind of improve patient care workflows with AI. I think we see workflow improvements across AI in all categories, kind of helping people work more efficiently. And I think healthcare has a lot of room for improvement there. We also see there's a company we have that's several years old that is doing medical billing, and that's something that just requires tens of man hours, tens of thousands of man hours per office per year to do. And so it's repetitive work that's perfectly suited for AI. So that company is doing incredibly well. And then I just invested in another company called Glass Health, which is also on the clinician side. So helping make better medical diagnoses. So there's a ton of opportunity here. I think just as in the broader ecosystem, it's not it's not a silver bullet for anything, but I do think in a couple of targeted areas that we could see a lot of impact.
And what are some of the concerns or ethical considerations or challenges that you're seeing that your portfolio companies are facing, or even you're thinking about advising your portfolio companies on as they look at building in and around the healthcare ecosystem?
For sure, transparency. So where there are a lot of times AI can be or feel like a black box. And so providing transparency into decision making and an auditable record is really important. One of my founders, Derek from Glass Health, he's done a ton of work around incorporating diverse sets of data as well. So I think that's something that healthcare does historically have a lot of inequity in outcomes for different groups, including women and minorities as well. And so it's especially important that not be further worsened by the use of AI. And one of the best practices I would also say, and this is less advice that I'm giving my companies, but that what I'm just seeing them do is having humans in the loop. So all of our companies are using it to augment clinicians, like make them faster or help them check their work, not replace them. And I think that's critical too, especially in healthcare.
So would you say innovation over the next 5-10 years is going to look more like that, where technology is superpowering the humans versus replacing the humans overall?
Yeah, I don't think you can replace humans or want to in healthcare. I do see that, administrative cost is estimated to be 1/3 of our healthcare spend. Right?
Yeah.
So if we find ways of cutting that down, it could reduce provider burnout, it could prevent medical errors, and it could reduce costs overall. We know that we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world. So cutting some of that would be, I think, net positive for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. It would be beneficial to the entire system, entire economy, each in every down to every individual if we can reduce some of that cost on that side. You talked a little bit around certain populations that have unmet needs and are still underserved when it comes to healthcare. You mentioned women, you mentioned minorities. What are some of these diverse populations and what are some of the unmet needs that you're seeing that you see as real opportunities for healthcare innovation?
I am really spending time in and wanting to find a company to invest in maternal health. The US has embarrassingly high maternal mortality rates. And to be honest, legislatures have worsened that problem with recent policies. And so that's an area that I'm really obsessed with right now. Women's health more generally, women are a huge market. I read a tweet this week which really stuck with me, which talked about how women are their family's chief medical officer. And I believe that that's true. But so far, they've been overlooked as decision makers as well as patients. I think we all know the stats on how women have not historically been included in clinical studies. I also think that sometimes women's healthcare, the impact of prevalent conditions on women or just women's health trends are not always, or sometimes overlooked. So I invested in an amazing company called Co-Fertility, which is women are having families, starting families later. And it's basically increased by a decade. I can even see that in my own family, that the difference between my grandmother to my mother to me, it's like 1 decade later of age.
Yeah.
Um, and as a huge demographic shift, women are starting families later, and they are helping women be more empowered around that choice by making it more affordable to freeze your eggs. So basically, if you donate half your eggs, you can freeze your eggs for free. And you're also then helping a family that needs help conceiving. So I do think that there are these areas that have inequity, but I see that as a massive opportunity. We have the resources to address these things. I think that the solutions are lacking, and that they're just incredible opportunities to try and address some of them.
I couldn't agree more on everything you said around the women's health piece. And in terms of what women's health really is, you talked a little bit about it, but there's maternal health. There's also things around how do you help be supportive on egg freezing. But there's also this demographic of people who are in perimenopause and menopause and this other kind of aging group. So it's really women's health from birth to death and what you can be doing to treat women not like small men, which I think is really fascinating overall. We talked a little bit about women's health, but what are some of the health and wellness strategies that you're employing on a day-to-day to make sure you're the healthiest and most productive version of yourself?
Probably like most people, I've tried a lot of things. I've, been monitoring my HRV. Right now I'm wearing a CGM to monitor my blood sugar. I have also tried monitoring my sleep really closely. Some of those things I definitely think are hugely impactful. But the ones that are probably the most meaningful for me, I would say I journal. I think journaling. I just invested in a company that is a sleep app, and they have a built-in journal in there. And I try to do that at night after 9 p.m. I find that to be part of my evening routine, quiet time after 9 p.m., curling up with a book and my journal. And my morning routine, I would probably say a lot of mornings I'm waking up at 6 o'clock and going to a hot yoga class. And other than that, trying to hike a lot. I used to be a really active runner, but I haven't really been lately. So mostly it's walking and yoga for me.
What would you say your go-tos are as it relates to managing stress or managing mental health? I know you mentioned journaling at night, which is, I'm sure, part of the practice, but is there any other strategies you use to manage your stress?
Exercise and meditation. I'm not a great meditator, but at least just even finding time to sit down and not be doing anything is where I start. And we have to have things like that. but really just exercise, like trying to get some time outside and moving every day. I'm proud to say that I've been doing 10 to 15,000 steps every day this summer. So
That's amazing. What are some of the ways that you've gotten that in? Is it walking outside? Do you have any other tips or tricks to get in the 10 to 15,000 steps?
yeah, it's walking outside. If I do walking meetings, I find that that's a huge step bump. So I definitely try to incorporate more of those if I can.
And you mentioned tracking your sleep metrics as well. What are the metrics that you're looking at, and how do you use them in your day to day?
Well, I'm not doing it anymore, but I was a pretty active Whoop user for a long time. And so they look at your recovery score and hours of sleep. And more recently, I've been using this sleep app that we just invested in. And that they're also looking at how many times you wake up in the middle of the night. It's actually addressing insomnia. So, but I've been using it just to track my sleep regardless. And they look at how many times you wake up and how tough it is to get to sleep. So I keep a log of those.
And you mentioned you're using a CGM right now. What are some of the benefits or reasons that you have that on?
Well, I have a huge family history of diabetes. All four of my grandparents, all my aunts and uncles, except for my parents, have diabetes, and I'm pre-diabetic. So I've been really. I read a book called The Diabetes Cure earlier this summer, and one of the really fascinating takeaways was that even though you can look at your glycemic index, or even though individual foods have a glycemic index, it's actually just an average. And your glycemic index is per person is individualistic for every food that you eat. So it's been really fascinating to try out different foods and see how they affect my blood sugar. I've basically learned that having a bagel is worse for me than going to a wine tasting. So, or more usefully, that I take a 10-minute walk after a meal, I don't have a blood sugar bump. So that's been something I've been trying to incorporate.
It's really something, especially during my pregnancies, I've actually used it instead of those horrible glucose tests.
Yeah.
I'll use a CGM just to see where I am and see what's working, because one reading isn't going to tell you a ton, and you want to make sure that what you're eating, regardless of pregnancies or not, where you are in your life, that you have a sense of what will spike it and what won't, and where you are from understanding your body perspective. I think they're very, very valuable, as is HRV, as is sleep tracking. A lot of that, just understanding what's going on is always helpful to pair with intuition.
I totally agree. And I think also it's not really part of the ethos so much, like the general consciousness, that awareness of how much sugar impacts your overall health. But I do feel like it's becoming more, people are becoming more aware of that. I certainly think early adopters or people who are really health optimizers are more aware of that, but there's so many other diseases that are where your risk is increased because of your blood sugar levels. And so there's CGMs becoming so prevalent, I think has really helped people come to grips with that and have better tools for figuring that out.
100%. And I'm actually one that's hopeful about this next generation, because we have people that are raising kids that have a much better understanding of what sugar is, where it is, what it does to your body, and helping their children make better choices overall, because it's such a learned behavior so early on that I do have hope for the next generation. A lot of people don't, but I'm someone that's hopeful.
No, I totally agree. It's sometimes it's a cultural moment of difference between me and, say, my parents or my in-laws, where they have grown up with just this expectation that, you're eating candy or popsicles and it's fine. And now most of the food that I give my kids is sugar-free. And that's also helpful too, and I think that's driven by consumer demand. So it's nice that your kids don't have to feel like they're going without, like they're still having treats. There's just lower sugar. So I think that's huge. I
Exactly.
totally agree with you.
Exactly. And I think that also applies to a little bit of what we were talking about before, where the diagnostics, all of this access to data, or this next generation is going to have so much more knowledge about what's going on in their bodies and what they need from a personalized health wellness routine to make sure that they are staying healthy, they're staying fit, they're managing their glucose, so that we have this kind of future that looks brighter than the current health system does today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Are there any trends across health and wellness that you've tried that haven't worked for you?
I have never really had much success with keto or diets that restrict certain category, like big categories of food besides sugar. And so I would say that I haven't, none of those have really stuck with me. I also am never going to be a cold plunge person.
I did a podcast with Ryan, one of the founders of Plunge,
Uh-huh.
one of the trendy cold plungers on the market. They're beautiful. I really want to try it, but I am also someone who is terrified of going into that. It just feels very hard to get over. So even being a very, very wellness person, I'm going to try it at some point, but I agree with you. It's a scary place to start.
I can do it every so
We
often, but I'm not somebody who's going to do it every week. And I mean, the positive thing about that is that I've read that some studies saying that it may not have as high efficacy for women. So you and I are maybe a little bit off the hook.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's very interesting to see, all right, this is really beneficial, but for who? That's always the question I've started asking when it comes to, all right, everyone should be doing keto, or everyone should be doing intermittent fasting, or everyone should be doing cold plunging. There's always this is the actual population that the research is around versus it's an everyone kind of commentary.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about stress, mental health, and various other kind of wellness strategies. Obviously, you have a very demanding job, very busy person. What are some things that you do to maintain focus and make sure your cognition and your clarity, mental clarity is there on a day-to-day basis?
I definitely find that days where I'm exercising, I have way more energy and I'm more focused. And so I do try to do it every day, ideally early in the morning, because that's the only time that's kind of sacred and there are no other demands on my time. And other than that, I mean, trying to get out for walks, especially at lunchtime, or taking breaks throughout the day. I used to stack my meetings, so I would have 8 meetings in a row, like all back to back to back to back. And I definitely been trying to do less of that. And finally, like the most simple thing, which I do, is just having a list next to me at like kind of at all times of what are things I need to follow up on and what's my schedule for the day. So kind of keeping that top of mind. Not rocket science, but sometimes the basics work really well.
It's figuring out those foundational strategies that really work for you and continuing to perfect and optimize them over time. So it sounds like you've tried some things that didn't work and have found some ways to help progress further in stuff that does.
Yes, I've also, and probably this is um, I don't think this is the most popular strategy, but I've actually completely gone off of caffeine. So I find that I get jittery and I can't sleep. So I've completely gone off of it. And that's my other small thing that I do.
I think a lot of people are doing that. It's more of a trend now. We're seeing a lot of research around caffeine and anxiety, caffeine and problems around circadian health, which also impacts glucose and other major hormones around insulin, around cortisol. And so that caffeine switch, a lot of people I am seeing do that. It's not something I've tried fully yet. I'm basically a 1 cup of coffee before 9 a.m. type of person. Because another interesting thing around caffeine is that its half-life is between like 5 to 7 hours. So people that are drinking it later in the day, you still have 50% of the caffeine in your system when you try to go to sleep. And then they wonder why there's sleep problems.
Yeah.
But I was someone who was very low caffeine for a lot of my life until I was in my late 20s. I even did investment banking for 4 years without drinking coffee, which still to this day, I don't know how I did that. But I think that caffeine, it works for some people and it doesn't work for others. So I think that's a really valid strategy to go to do.
I totally agree. And it's not because I don't love coffee or a really great cup of chai, but yeah, it's just I found that I'm better and healthier if I'm not. So
Have you replaced your caffeine with any other daily rituals?
um I drink a lot of tea, but it's mostly herbal, and I would just say I drink a ton of water and seltzer. I would love to find one to replace it, but I haven't yet.
As we think about kind of the future of health going forward, we talked a lot about the opportunities. We've talked a lot about some interesting technologies going forward. But for any founders that might be listening, what are the types of founders that you find are really successful in innovating in healthcare? And what are the kind of qualities that you're looking for as an investor for folks who are tackling some of these big problems?
Well, I would say that the most successful founders that I've worked with, they often have a personal connection to whatever problem that they're trying to solve for. So from my first days in venture, Elliot and TJ and the PillPack team, they had personally experienced, the problems of how hard it is to manage lots of medications if you're chronically ill. And so that was one of the things that they were addressing when they rebuilt the pharmacy stack. I think also, like even to one of the most recent founders that I invested in, both of the two co-founders had insomnia, and they found that current treatment options were too slow or ineffective, and that there weren't enough providers to really be able to get like the solutions that the science says are most effective. They weren't really available to most people, so they built it. So that personal lens, I think, is huge because it gives them the knowledge, and they don't have to have this learning curve about what's important and how treatment works. Another thing in healthcare is that credibility is so incredibly important. So whether they themselves are physicians building, and I have a couple of those that I've invested in over time, or they're scientists who are trying to make a better diagnostic, for example, they have that medical and scientific credibility to be able to, make sure that what they're making is scientifically valid and clinically safe. That's If you overlook or underestimate the importance of that, I think you can really, I don't think you can get off the ground. And then I would just say that interdisciplinary teams are really huge too, because, we didn't talk about it that much yet, but D2C healthcare has been such a huge trend over the past decade. And, you can't just have a great medical leader, a great, you know, um, great tech stack. You also have to have people who know how to do data-driven marketing, and who know how to build a consumer brand. And those a lot of times do not all exist. All of those skills do not exist in the same person. So you have to have interdisciplinary teams who can kind of do all of those separate pieces to get the whole system to work. So I would say that those three things are huge, and really key in teams that I invest in.
It sounds a lot like founder market fit, but also having the teams to fill out the gaps where the founders might not necessarily be the best, especially when you're dealing in more of a consumer facing lens. On the topic of D2C health, I would love to get your opinion on where are we today? What does the future of that look like? And maybe what went wrong for some of these companies that we're hearing about now that are maybe not to be repeated going forward?
Well, I think that there are very few examples of companies that have gone wrong. And when you talk about D2C health, sort of, I strongly disagree that D2C health is over. I know that the prevailing wisdom and is that, especially growth investors are not interested in paying for customer acquisition in companies that they fund. So they've definitely pulled back. And I see that with our companies, and I see that across the board. But I think it's important not to get caught up in the hype or the lack of hype with that. And I think some of those investors are looking at some of the wrong things. So many people think of it this way, but I do believe that empowered consumers are still a really big force, but the path is perhaps different. So the trend in the 2010s was that instead of selling to health insurance companies first, instead of trying to get hospitals to buy, both of which are really slow paths to market, and actually sometimes company killing paths to market, if you are waiting out an 18-month sales cycle, it's really hard to get a startup off the ground. And so instead, there are all these care gaps, there are all these inefficiencies, there are all these areas where maybe there are very few providers and you have to wait 6 or 9 or 12 months to get seen by someone. But these are urgent problems. People were opting into different modes, like they were finding solutions online and self-paying. And then I think insurers really had to follow suit because patients were choosing with their feet. I think that the landscape is very different now, but not in all bad ways. So patients have more choice now. They have more choice with insurance. They also still, and it's just better known how these full stack healthcare companies work now, right? Like there's a playbook. You have to have a chief medical officer. You need to build a brand. You need to have a tech stack. The pieces of that tech stack are more commoditized. You can build more quickly. They know to get clinical validation sometimes within the first year. I also see them now going for insurance reimbursement within the first year as well. And so I don't think that that trend where empowered consumers are making choices for their own health has gone away. In fact, if anything, I think it's just going to increase. Like you said yourself, right? Like more of us are tracking our own data. We're more in charge of our own health than we ever have been before. And I think the most important distinction is just that the path to building those companies might look a little bit different. And there are some companies that may not be as good of a profile to build in that way. Like if it's less of an urgent need, or they're high margin treatments, have better economics to get off the ground as a startup. So some of those things, and where there is a clear insurance pathway, then I think they have a much better ability to get off the ground. And so I really think that the hype about, or the anti-hype about direct to consumer being over is a little is focusing on some of the wrong things. And I think it's still a really important thing for consumers that that's an option, because well, founders can innovate faster than payers, and that's the reality. So um, we need it, right? Like who's going to address the fact that, like, who's going to address care provider shortages, right? Like I don't know how payers could do that, but I do believe that tech gives us the ability to scale, and for people to be seen where there are no providers of a certain type, they can be seen virtually. So I think some of these things are really important, and will continue.
It sounds like a lot of the hype is actually around acquisition and not wanting to pay exorbitant fees to the Facebooks, Twitters, Googles of the world, and not around the actual model of consumer focused care, where the brand still matters, the focus on the consumer, empowering the consumer still matters, and there are pathways to build sustainable business models in that. It's just more around, what does that acquisition model look like? How are the companies getting those consumers, and making sure that eventually, sooner rather than later, it can be paid for, which is not something that necessarily in the 2010s you saw as much of.
Yes, and it just means the economics are different. But the
Yeah.
economics, the tech stack is significantly easier and more componentized than it was, say, a decade ago. So you still had to do billing manually 10 years ago, and that's not true now. And now you have a half dozen choices or more for an EHR and a telehealth platform. I mean, a lot of this, I think that and then just patients being more and providers being more primed for telehealth is definitely also a change that we have post-COVID. So all of those things make it so much easier and more efficient to build a company like this. But I will say that I think some profiles of companies are more likely to get off the ground.
Well, Paul, it was such a great conversation. I'm so excited that you were able to be here with us today. Last question is just, how can people find out more about you and more about your work at Initialized?
I'm really optimistic about the future of healthcare, and especially about what software can do and what tech can do to scale. A lot of the solutions that we're starting to see, we've already seen that in the past 5 years more than ever before. I mean, our healthcare system just went through this massive change and transformation and really surpassed a lot of things that I don't know if we would have predicted it would have been able to do. So we're really excited about this space. My fund, Initialized, we are a dedicated pre-seed and seed fund. So we're investing in founders at the earliest stages. We have about 25 healthcare companies in our portfolio. The first 7 out of the first 10 are unicorns. So we've really gotten a great front row seat in being able to watch how they've evolved. And then many of them are younger, so they're up and coming. And if you're a founder building in one of the spaces that I talked about or somewhere else, we'd love to talk to you. Probably the easiest way to reach me is if you DM me on Twitter. I'm Parulia. It's Parulia. And I do read all my DMs, and I try to respond to as many as I can. And yeah, we're only investing inside of the US. But other than that, we're always excited to talk to people who are passionate about what they're building. So,
well, thanks so much for joining us today. And thank you to all of you for tuning in to another episode of the podcast.
Thanks, Rachel. Great to be here.